He was the one who was sending Saudis and Syrians and Iraqis to blow themselves up at the Assad regime's security installations. Again, I find it hard to match that sense of somebody who would push people to give their lives for his ideology with somebody who, to me, didn't come across as believing in very much but his own right to rule.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Nicolas Pelham, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Nick has worked in the Middle East and North Africa for more than 30 years and reported from every state in the region. Together, we discuss his latest article, The Great Pretender, How Ahmed al-Sharaa Won Syria, an in-depth profile based in part on a mid-February interview he had with Ashara. Then I continue the conversation with Ninar Fawal and Natasha to discuss Ashara's opportunities and challenges and what they mean for Syria's future. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Your remarkable profile of Ahmed al-Sharaa began by describing him as refreshingly pragmatic or profoundly untrustworthy. Is that something your sources felt or something you ended up feeling after reporting the story and talking to him?
It's certainly something that many of the people that I spoke to felt. I suppose this is a man who's just been through so many different transformations and so many different personas, so many different nom de guerre, so many different dress styles. His career changes have just been phenomenal. I spent the best part of 3 months in Syria trying to find out as much as I could about the man. It's really hard to find a single constant about him except for the one overriding fact that this man has done all he could to achieve power and keep it. And he has changed hats, changed organizations so many times, convinced many people that he is something other than the man he's turned out to be. The one fact that we know about him is that he's true to himself and he wants power and he intends to keep it by fair means or foul.
The way I read your profile, the remarkable thing is his ability to win the trust of people. He became Abu Musab Zarqawi's deputy in Iraq. He became a trusted lieutenant of Abdelatif Baghdadi before they split and had tensions. What seems remarkable to me is that in very difficult, strained situations, he managed to persuade powerful people that he was their guy.
Yeah, I mean, he's managed to outsmart some very smart people. And if you look back very early on when he went off to Iraq just before the American invasion and was pretty disillusioned, came back to Damascus, hung out with groups that were looking at trying to spread jihadism across the Middle East, primarily into Iraq to destabilize the American operation, was picked up by Syrian Mukhabarat, and everyone else in the group that he was picked up with was sent off to Saidnaya. He was let go.
Is the infamous prison full of torture and death?
Absolutely. And he managed to convince them that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and was on his way to a shisha bar, and they let him go. You find that same ability to deceive when he's picked up by the Americans in Iraq, when he's in Mosul, caught planting explosives, managed to convince them through his ability to speak an Iraqi dialect, which he's picked up incredibly quickly. Manages to convince both his American interrogators and his Iraqi interrogators that he's an Iraqi, and then spends the rest of his jail term in what became laboratories for an Iraqi jihad, and then befriended the cohorts of Abu Bakr Baghdadi, as you said, manages to convince Abu Bakr Baghdadi, who's the head of Islamic State, that he should be his point man for Syria, is sent off to Syria, then tries to establish his own organization. And when Abu Bakr Baghdadi calls him back and tells him that he's merging his organization into the Islamic State, says no, and manages to convince the head of Al-Qaeda that he will be his loyal deputy in Syria, and again betrays him. And in the jihadi world, once you swear an oath of fealty, your loyalty, you're held to that. And somehow he manages each time to convince another jihadi group that he will be their man on the ground. And so there are many who are left asking how to trust this new version of the man who was Abu Muhammad al-Jalani and has gone back to his childhood name of Ahmed al-Sharaa. How can you trust this latest guise? Who exactly is the man that is now the self-declared president of Syria?
I was also struck, you have a passage in your piece that Hezbollah, the first Islamist group to deploy suicide bombers, used to spend years grooming martyrs, dangling the promise of a better afterlife. Hamas is said to have taken months, and Ashara is said to have prided himself on converting novices to killers in matters of weeks. It seems that his persuasive power is not only of people with tremendous power and authority over him, but also of people below him.
I find it very hard to match the reputation with the man that I met in the People's Palace in Damascus. The man that I met was somebody who said all the right things, but didn't look comfortable, particularly saying them. He was fidgeting, playing with his nose, his feet sort of moved back and forwards. He didn't particularly like having to meet my editor and the rest of the Economist team at the time. It was kind of quite stilted and awkward, and it was really hard to establish any sort of personal touch with him. And I was trying to understand, how is this the man who sent scores of, if not hundreds of Syrians and foreign fighters off to become suicide bombers and give their lives for the cause? He didn't come across to me as somebody who had a huge amount of charisma or was somebody who I'd want to die for what he believed in. And I was trying to work out what was it that people saw in him. And yet this was somebody who really introduced suicide bombing into the Syrian uprising, the Arab Spring in 2011. He was the prime driver of turning what had been a popular uprising into a jihadi onslaught against the Assad regime. And he was the one who was sending Saudis and Syrians and Iraqis to blow themselves up at the Assad regime's security installations. Again, I find it hard to match that sense of somebody who would push people to give their lives for his ideology with somebody who, to me, didn't come across as believing in very much his own right to rule.
One of the themes that comes across several times in your piece is how soft-spoken he is. One of the things that always struck me when I watched videos of both Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki, who also inspired people to die for their cause, was they also were relatively self-spoken. They came across as reluctantly reaching the conclusions that the only option is to fight and die. Did you think that his reluctance, his soft-spokenness was somehow modeled or similar to these other jihadi leaders? Or is there something even more awkward going on, something different in your mind?
We tend to think of extremists as people who are going to be fire and brimstone preachers who are going to be screaming at us and telling us that there's only one way to salvation. And the man that I met was somebody who was a lot more measured, a lot more calculating, a lot more Machiavellian. When you look at the way that he's tried to present himself in the past, it certainly does look as if bin Laden had been a model. If you look at the fatigues with the Afghan headdress, the white Afghan headdress, that was drawn straight out of the costume of Osama bin Laden. But the man that I met was somebody who reminded me much more of the previous incumbent in the palace, Bashar al-Assad. He was somebody who was shy, introverted, slightly awkward, soft-spoken. There was something uncannily similar in the mannerisms of the current president and the previous one that I'm still struggling to understand. And if anything, I think that it's the model of the previous system of Syria that may have the most bearing on the new governance that is coming to Syria under Ahmed al-Sharaa.
You suggested that it was raising the issue of Israel that seemed to make him most uncomfortable and brought your meeting to the end. Is that what happened, or was there something else going on that you thought precipitated the end of your conversation?
Normally, when you meet heads of state in the Middle East, they're very well prepped. They've spent a lot of time preparing. They've had advisors discuss questions and answers. They've got a message that they want to impart. And this was very different. What was most astonishing about it was that it didn't really seem to be his show, although he was the one who was speaking. It was much more the man who was sitting next to him. Shaybani, the foreign minister, and one of his closest advisors, the one who set up his media department. It was he that called time on the interview, pretty much pulled Ahmed al-Sharaa up, and Sharaa sort of apologized and said, "Sorry, I have to go," in English. And it really seemed that he was almost at Shaybani's beck and call. His advisor also didn't really have much experience of comms. She'd only been in the country for a month. She was a daughter of a Syrian exile. The impression that I was left with was that he doesn't really have a team that can fill the presidential palace. It felt eerily empty. He was trying to fill shoes which didn't quite fit.
I visited Assad twice at the presidential palace early in his rule, and it always felt cold and empty. It always felt to me like that long hallway with a red carpet leading to the presidential office was a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, and was intended to inspire awe, but ultimately felt like a very strange architectural feature that is unlike any presidential office I've ever seen, where it's surrounded by people supporting the president. And the presidential palace in Damascus always seemed to me to accentuate the separateness of the president from anybody supporting him. It's a strange place.
Yeah. And bizarrely, it's called the People's Palace, and yet it couldn't feel more removed. It's up on a hill above Damascus, and you do feel the separation from the rest of the city. I was trying to understand, how is this man going to connect with the city below? He's been out of Damascus since 2003, so over 20 years. And he comes back sort of having spent his world really within a jihadi milieu.
It's remarkable to me that his messaging has seemed so well calibrated. I have been struck that the messaging coming out has been the same in Arabic and English from the interim government. It seems to be a fairly sophisticated calibration of what all the foreign interests want from Syria, expect from Syria.
It feels like somebody who, in a sense, knows what the lines that the world wants to hear, possibly his own people want to hear, but it's sort of going through the motions. There's remarkably little follow through. And although he's met a very large number of people, decision-making is held within a tiny cluster of maybe 5 or 6 people. And the complaints you hear again and again are A, that this man is overwhelmed and his clique is overwhelmed. B, they don't want to delegate. They don't trust others around them. And in a sense, their way of running a very complex country full of multiple sects and ethnicities is very much the Idlib model, the model that they adopted when they ran a small enclave in the northwest of Syria, and run it pretty much like a militia. It's that same sort of secretive, distrusting, paranoid approach to the outside world, and the sense that once you've got power, you need to hang on to it at all costs, and that power sharing is going to be a slippery slope to losing power altogether.
You suggest several times in the article that he is arrayed against a number of ethnic militias, other kinds of forces. He's not necessarily the strongest of all of them. Who are the other powerful factions in Syria? There's the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast, the Kurdish group. Who are the other armed factions that matter that he is trying to establish control over?
If you look at the geopolitical map of Syria, it looks very much like the geopolitical map that existed under Bashar al-Assad. If anything, it's even more of a patchwork. You've got a central spine running from Damascus up to Aleppo, which remains under Shara's control. But then when you go beyond that spine, you see bits of the country keeping their distance, slipping away. In the north, you still have the multiple militia groups that get most of their salary payments via the Turks, and they're the old Sunni rebel factions who fought the Assad regime. They have yet to hand over their weapons, and they still control a band along the Turkish border that runs from Ashara's former enclave of Idlib towards the northeast of Syria. Also in the northeast, you have, as you said, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which is a Kurdish-led militia that occupies most of the best farmland in Syria and its prime oil fields. If you then go clockwise around Syria's borders, you get to another Sunni rebel zone of Tanf, and again, they're under American protection. They don't seem to have handed over their weapons. You then get north of the Jordanian border to the southern front. There are also tribal Sunni militia that were the first to get to Damascus, but have since retreated back towards the Jordanian border around Daraa. They have reservations about Shara's rule. Alongside them are the Druze. Many of their leaders seem increasingly to be looking to Israel for protection. And you then go up along the coast to the Alawite heartlands. which was the Assad sect and comprised a lot of the security infrastructure of the former regime. And they seem to be trying to keep Shara's forces at bay. And there's been an upsurge of fighting there and horrific atrocities, but that seems to have been sparked by Ashara's efforts to establish checkpoints and patrols and conduct arrests of people that they accuse of working with the former regime. Really, all around this central spine, you've got bits of Syria which some of them have nominally accepted Ashara's rule, but all of them have kept their weapons and all of them want to essentially have a degree of autonomy and rule themselves and are very nervous of who and what Ashara's governance is going to look like.
How powerful do you think Turkey and Turkish intelligence is in helping secure Ashara, in putting some boundaries on what Ashara does? Are they decisive, or were they a catalyst and now we're in a secondary role?
They were certainly a catalyst at the end of November for Ashara's push towards Aleppo. I'm not sure they're a catalyst for much beyond. It seems that Turkey, having tried to reach out to Assad and essentially do a deal which would provide for a return of refugees from Turkey, was snubbed by Assad and thought that there was essentially gave up on any hope of a rapprochement with Syria under Assad and decided the only way that they could secure a return of refugees was to expand rebel-held territory in the north and take Aleppo. But beyond that, at some point, Ashara begins to diverge and had a difficult relationship with Turkey even before that. And so many of the aspirations that Turkey had for Syria and Ashara have yet to be realized. I think they were hoping for a maritime agreement. They were hoping for a defense agreement with Ashara. Those don't appear to have materialized when Ashara went to Ankara. Turkey probably had expected that they were going to be sort of, at the very least, sort of primus and extend their zone of influence into Syria. And yet it feels as if Ashara is carving out something of a separate course. I'm not sure it's an entirely independent course, but he does look as if he's at least as beholden to the Saudis as he is to the Turks.
One of the other powers that matters is the United States, which helped broker the deal between Ashara and the SDF, the Kurdish group. Some people in Washington certainly think that that's a prerequisite for the U.S. to withdraw from Syria because there would be confidence that the counter-ISIS fight in northeast Syria would not collapse because of fighting between the Kurdish groups and the Ashara government. What do you think the future of the U.S. presence in Syria is going to be? And what is the Syrian assessment of the future U.S. role and what they want the future U.S. role to be?
It was striking in the interview that we did with Ashara that he was quite positive about coming to an agreement with Russia and its bases in Syria. But he was frustrated that he hadn't had a similar agreement with the US.
When was this interview?
It was about a month ago.
Okay, so it was in the middle of February. He came to power December 8th.
The way that he'd presented himself on taking power, that somehow he could bring Syria back into a Western orbit. He chased out the Iranians, looked as if the Russians were going to abandon their base, and that he was going to reorientate Syria into a pro-American Western fold. And that hasn't happened. Critically, if he's going to make Syria work, he needs to be able to pay his fighters. He needs to be able to bring other fighters on board. If he wants to establish a new Syrian army, he needs to attract the militias that we talked about into the army and to be able to pay them. He needs to be able to pay his own civil service. And since December the 8th, Syrians, by and large, have not been paid, and they haven't been paid because of sanctions. Other donor states in the region, the Qataris, the Saudis, have flinched at providing finance which would allow him to pay those salaries because of sanctions. There is real destitution now in Syria. The economy was already broken under the Assads. It's got even worse under Ashara. And that sort of early confidence boost is evaporating really fast. People talk about the end of the honeymoon period, the sense in which maybe Ashara isn't going to be the solution to Syria's problems. I think he was expecting that the West would come on board with a post-Assad regime. And those expectations in hindsight look naive. There's a lot of nervousness about who Ashara is and what sort of Syria he wants to run. And there's concern that he really hasn't been as inclusive in his methods of running the country as initially he'd promised. It looks as if he's trying to gut the country in a similar way to the way that Paul Bremer did when he took over Iraq. He's dissolved the old armed forces. the old security forces, not just sort of intelligence apparatus that impose this reign of terror on Syria, but even the traffic police. He's purged vast numbers from the civil service. Hospital administrators have been kicked out of their jobs. There's a sense in which the country is barely struggling to function under Bashar al-Assad and is now even more dysfunctional because of some of the steps that he's taken. In the same way that he was going through the motions when we interviewed him, he goes through the motions when it comes to a national dialogue or a constitutional declaration, that it's all hurried and he wants to get it out of the way, but it's not particularly sincere or genuine. When he talks about democracy, you have to extract the word, and it's like extracting a tooth. Ultimately, the Syria that he seems to want to lead is a Syria that in many ways looks like that old totalitarian system that existed under Bashar al-Assad, one of absolute control. Even he talks of having a legislative assembly, but wants to appoint all its members. He makes a show of listening when he meets different segments of Syrian society. But ultimately, the decisions that materialize seems to be one that essentially serve his own hold on power. He's brought his government from Idlib and imposed that on Syria. He was supposed to be establishing an interim government, which was more inclusive, but he's delivered on that. Syrians, unlike regime change in Iraq or in Libya, seem to give the new system a vote of confidence by going back to work, getting the transport systems running, the schools running, the hospitals running, the courts running. There is a willingness to make Syria work under Ahmed al-Sharaa, and yet he seems to sort of taken that for granted and just tried to monopolize power rather than recognize the degree to which all Syrians helped engineer the ousting of Bashar al-Assad. And there'll be many reasons why this might not work, and clearly sanctions are one of them. But a lot of the responsibility is going to rest with Ahmed al-Sharaa and the clique around him.
Gulf governments, Turkish governments that are not staking their position towards Syria on how much democracy there is, are they interested enough to salvage this government to help it consolidate power? Or do you feel there really does need to be Western support that can only be gathered through moves toward pluralism and democratization?
I think the dilemma that faces countries in the region is very similar to the dilemma that existed under Bashar al-Assad. You've got someone in power that you don't particularly trust, whose background makes you nervous. The Jordanians and others still consider him to be a terrorist in a suit. And yet the fear of yet another round of bloodshed in Syria scares them, I think, even more. And there could be many more refugees that pour out of Syria again. And what I was saying of the Syrian population, I think it largely holds for many in the region. They want, not all in the region, but many in the region, they want a Syria that can get back on its feet and functions. But there's also recognition that for Syria to function properly, it needs to come together, and it needs a form of power sharing, which includes all the various elements of Syrian society that we discussed. I think the great fear of many Syrians and many in the region is that if Sharaa does feel beleaguered, the more precarious his rule becomes, the more he will retreat and rely on that kind of rump base of those who want to see a Sunni supremacist state, that actually he's going to go back to those who he knows best and trusts the most, which are his old jihadi core. And so I think there's this dilemma about the sanctions. Do you tie an easing, a suspension of sanctions to greater pluralism in Syria, to more power sharing? Or do you run the risk that actually the longer sanctions remain in place, the more precarious Ashara's rule is going to become, and the more he will retreat into that kind of core base that, for understandable reasons, thought that they'd reached an age of salvation, and yet 3 months on, are still in these huge refugee camps. They're told in some ways that they own the new Syria, but actually they're still stuck in refugee camps. And for them, the more affluent areas of Syria where you do find Alawites and Christians look like a very tempting prize, look like spoils of war. And I think a lot of the drivers behind the massacres that took place in Alawite areas have economic drivers, that Alawites by and large did live more affluent lifestyles. There is this risk that the more desperate people become, the more frustrated people become, the more Sunnis in the north will look to sweep south and try and take over the properties and cars and the relative wealth that exists on the coast and in Damascus. And the more other minorities and sects will reach out to foreign powers and seek their protection. And the more divided Syria will become. And actually what the hopes of turning a new page and Syria could find itself back in another civil war, it's a real risk. There does seem to be, there was a coming together after December the 8th. and the country now feels as if it's pulling apart. The one glimmer of hope that has come from the Kurds and this agreement that took place between the commander of the SDF and Ahmed al-Sharaa, which on paper provides for some merger between the northeast, which has the oil fields and has the farmland and has been outside central government control for over a decade. The kind of reservation that many have is that this is an agreement which seems to delay an actual merger that gives the Kurds and the Syrians until the end of the year to find some way of integrating into a new order. It's still not clear what degree of autonomy, decentralization, federalism Ashara wants to offer the Kurds and other groups in Syria. And from what we've seen over the past 3 months, I think his instincts are going to be to maintain as much control as he possibly can.
You've done some really remarkable long profiles in The Economist. You did a profile of Mohammed bin Salman. You did a profile of King Mohammed VI of Morocco. You now have done this profile of Ahmed al-Sharaa. What are the similarities that you see between Sharaa and these two canny, sometimes hard to understand rulers? And where do you think Sharaa is really different from these other rulers?
Brilliant question. Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed VI of Morocco were both born into power. They had very different relationships with power. Mohammed bin Salman was hungry for it. Mohammed VI of Morocco, in many ways, was horrified by it and has had a difficult relationship with his father's system. Ahmed al-Sharaa comes from a very different place. In many ways, he's more similar to Hafiz al-Assad than he is to the founder of the Assad dynasty, than he is to the other leaders that I've profiled. He's had to fight his way to power. He wasn't born into it. If you had to pick somebody who you would expect to kind of rule Syria, to be a successor to Bashar al-Assad, he was an unlikely contender. And yet he's been very astute at climbing his way, at acquiring power. He's very cunning. He had a disastrous week, and when his own base was running rampage through Alawite areas, it really looked as if many in the region and in his own country were going to wash their hands of him. And then within a few days, he managed to claw back credibility with a deal with the Kurds, which I don't think anyone had really seen coming, and give Syrians hope that the country could be reunited under his rule. So he's somebody he's self-made in a way that the others weren't. And I think he looked to others for role models. Mohammed bin Salman probably is a model of a strong man that he would like to be. He's making many of the decisions that strong men do. He's putting his family into positions of authority. He's giving them homes and taking over the homes of the former regime apparatchiks in the best part of Damascus and giving them to his own, giving the home of a senior general under Assad to his brother and making his brother health minister, making another brother, putting him in charge of the investment authority, putting somebody said to be his brother-in-law in charge of the ports authority. So it looks as if he's trying to establish himself as a strong man, but he's conscious, I think, that he's not there yet, that this wasn't a role that he's born into. It's a role that he has to grab, and having grabbed, consolidate. And I think in many ways, this Syria looks more like an old Syria, whereas if you look to Mohammed VI and if you look to MBS, they were trying to do something very new with the kingdoms that they inherited. In many ways, it feels to me as if Ahmed al-Sharaa is changing the pecking order, but essentially keeping the nature of the state in place. This could, in hindsight, if he gets his way, could end up looking more like a coup than a revolution.
Nicolas Pelham, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you for having me, John. Pleasure.
Why have some Western states been reluctant to lift sanctions?
I think that the European countries and the UK has actually been quite forward-looking on removing sanctions or suspending them at this rate. They know that a failed Syria is not good for them and not in their national security interests because of the migration issue, because of potential terrorism, vacuums of power in Syria. And then they recognize that economic recovery is an essential part of that. Where the challenges, I think, lie is U.S. sanctions, which are very stringent and include secondary sanctions, which means that they could potentially punish another country for doing business with Syria. Now, it's not entirely clear why these sanctions aren't being revisited in a more proactive way. These sanctions were imposed on the former regime, which no longer exists. Some have noted that it could be a tool to sort of guide this new government that a lot of people are concerned about into a positive, more sort of inclusive direction. The problem is that we haven't seen that engagement at all. The current government, led by Ashara, has been making not just positive statements, but positive moves. I've spoken to Syrians that just got back from the National Dialogue Conference a few days ago, which many complained was a bit hurried. But what they did say is that no subjects were off limits. And so I think if people want to see a more inclusive Syria, a more accepting Syria, and that's the standard for removing sanctions or suspending them, we need to see that engagement now, because we don't have a big window of opportunity before things really start to spiral out of control. And the reality is there's such a tangled web of sanctions that it's going to take months or even years to start removing them. So it's a really complicated process, and that really needs to start now because Syrians don't have salaries. There's no way to pay security services or security forces to keep things under control, and that's why we've seen some violence in recent days. And then beyond that, I think it's really easy to exploit a sanctioned country because they have very few overt, acceptable partners in terms of financial transactions, diplomacy, etc.
The challenge from a U.S. government perspective is partly, I think, a reluctance to help secure a government that could turn more either threatening or authoritarian. There's a lot of uncertainty what Ahmed al-Shara's intentions are, and I think that came across in the interview. So given that a lot of these transitions can go in negative directions, I think there's an instinct among a number of people in the U.S. and more broadly to take things slowly and to try to maintain leverage where one can, to try to at least have tools to steer the interim government in Syria in a positive direction. The other thing, which has nothing to do with the Syrians, is you still have a U.S. government, which in some ways is an interim government. We don't have confirmed people in many of the positions. Joel Rayburn has been nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, knows a lot about Syria, but isn't in place. And for the U.S. government to go through a decision process without a lot of presidential appointees in place is often difficult. It's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And as Natasha points out, the window of opportunity doesn't stay open indefinitely. There are consequences for not acting now. And one gets the impression when you speak to people in the U.S. government that coming to a conclusion on these issues is not seen as an important priority. I think because of the centrality of Syria to so many issues in the region and surrounding countries, they owe it to themselves to have some sort of focused discussion even before all the presidential nominees are in place.
What lessons can we draw from previous transitions in the region, and how can that help determine whether outside powers are engaging too quickly or too slowly with Syria's new government?
It seems to me that there have been a lot of instances where there's been enthusiasm at the beginning for new governments, which hasn't always played out. Certainly, I remember from when I was in high school, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which had a lot of enthusiasm for what a new post-authoritarian regime would look like in Iran, which turned into a new authoritarian regime, which in many ways was more threatening to the United States than their predecessors, going back to the 1950s. There were articles in American magazines about how Mohammed Naguib, the titular leader of the 1952 revolution in Egypt, was an Egyptian Abraham Lincoln. There's something about immediate post-revolutionary governments that a lot of people around the world get very enthusiastic about. They project hopes and dreams onto these new leaders, partly because there's a sense that they've overcome to struggle, partly because they haven't created a track record that contradicts the hopes and dreams. The reality, I think, is in every post-revolutionary situation, there are a lot of people who are willing to take large risks for power. It requires a large amount of a canny ability to navigate politics that most people haven't gotten before they've been in power. Most people haven't quite figured out how to turn down people who are aspirants to power. And often people manifest themselves differently as leaders once they've gotten some experience than when they've come up. I think that the challenge in Syria is understanding partly what are the opportunities with this leadership, but partly what are the other constituencies, what are the competitions that can unfold in Syria that would lead toward healthy competition, more inclusive government, economic development, all those kinds of things that would lead Syria toward a better future. What tools does the United States and its partners and allies have? I think the other reality of all of this is when you've had a change in government, it's the people on the inside who have the greatest influence for all the policy discussions you have in Western capitals about what you want to have happen. The real determinant ends up being the people on the ground, relationships on the ground that you never even know about, and people who are fighting not only for their own futures, but for the futures of their children and grandchildren. And those people are ultimately going to have a lot more influence over outcomes than American government officials who might deal with this issue for a year or two or three.
There are a lot of positive differences between what we're seeing in Syria and some of the transitions we've seen throughout the Middle East. Jon alluded to the Iranian Revolution, if you want to call it that, in 1979. I mean, there was positive signs, I think, from some Iranians of all political stripes at the very beginning. This is true. But it certainly didn't seem to be in U.S. interests as the hostage crisis quickly spiraled out of control under the Carter administration. In the case of Saddam Hussein, he spent very little time not just consolidating power, but publicly executing anyone who was an opponent or could be an opponent or a competitor, and did so in a really shockingly public way. We're not seeing that here. We're actually seeing quite the opposite. We are seeing a government that has tried to reach out to the United States and to European governments immediately, has made overtures not just protect minorities, but to protect their rights. And we're seeing that. The issue, and this is where I might disagree with Jon a little bit, I do think the United States has an enormous amount of leverage on where this goes, even when it's not there, even in an indirect way through sanctions and terrorism designations. This is a country that is undergoing a liquidity crisis, amongst other things, and that has forced it to reach back out to Russia, of all countries, a country responsible for raising much of the country to the ground, in order to get banknotes, because it's a company there that prints out Syrian notes. And so it's suffering under 1 hour of electricity per day. And a big reason for this is because it used to rely on Iranian oil shipments, which are no longer a reality. And I think other countries have offered assistance, but honestly, they're scared of either U.S. sanctions or U.S. punishment for dealing with this government. So while I think a lot remains uncertain, there is certainly a lot that the U.S. can do to at least steady the ship and ensure that it isn't a failed state within weeks or months rather than much further down the line. But I think in the trajectory that we're seeing, things will get worse much more quickly.
Although Nick Pelham's argument, based on what he saw in Syria, is that there are partly the challenges of U.S. sanctions policy, and there's also the challenges of a new revolutionary leadership that tends to be paranoid, that tends not to be very good at delegating, that has fired a lot of existing officials. I mean, I think it's a complicated picture, and the question is ultimately, how do you use the tools of U.S. policy to drive things in a constructive direction? Part of that is understanding how much leverage you have. Part of it is understanding what you don't have leverage to do. And part of it is determining what's an acceptable outcome. And for those of us on the outside, it's hard to see a lot of evidence that the Trump administration has really tried hard to work through these issues. Instead, it feels like this is a secondary or tertiary issue in the Middle East. Clearly, you have issues with Gaza, you have issues with Iran, you have a current set of hostilities with the Houthis. There are other things crowding the agenda. But it does seem to me that the problems in Syria are both complicated, but also important.
To that point, actually, though, Ashara actually said the revolution is over when he started. He did not want people to think that conflict would spill over borders, that the revolution would spill over borders. And so he made that really concerted effort to say that there was no conflict with any of Syria's neighbors, for example, no conflict with other minorities in the country as well. So we've seen those positive statements. In addition to that, this government actually provided amnesty to the security forces for the most part. In fact, they went out of their way to say that they were just going to go after the decision makers, quote unquote, which I assume is the more high-ranking people that were charged with war crimes. That was actually much to the dismay of many Syrians as well. But it shows the pragmatism that was there initially. Now, again, the further things spiral, the harder it's going to be to maintain that kind of pragmatism that leads to hopefully a more stable future for everyone, including Syrians.
What should the international community prioritize when it comes to Syria, and how ambitious and involved should it be?
There are many countries that want to help Syria, that don't want to see this experiment failed. I think from the US's perspective, this is a strategic opportunity that could be lost to push both Russia and Iran out of this really key central point in the region, and also to prevent a sort of vacuum of power that could lead to greater instability like we saw with ISIS and others in the region. And in order to do that, as I said, I don't think everything can happen at once. As Jon was mentioning, there's still people that need to be confirmed. But I think certainly comforting European countries or Gulf countries and others that want to help in Syria to say, you can do this and you will not be punished, I think would be one step in that process. I think engaging on a direct level with the new government, if there are issues of inclusivity, security, etc., to start doing that now, because that just takes a phone call. That doesn't take a whole lot. And then gradually start to think about how to begin to untangle some of these sanctions, especially on the banking sector, but also major economic sectors like oil, energy, etc. In addition to that, I think it's really trying to prevent, in it as far as the United States can, external forces from sabotaging the process beforehand. And that goes for Hezbollah. We've seen some clashes recently. Iran potentially re-entering, Russia potentially re-entering. Immediately after the fall of Assad, we saw 500 attacks from Israel and occupied territory from Israel, and reports that Netanyahu's cabinet has been lobbying the United States to allow Russia to come back and not to lift sanctions, things like that. But I think the United States really needs to set its own foreign policy. And it strikes me that especially this administration, but administrations past as well, don't want to deal with another war in the Middle East. They have strategic reasons to prioritize other things. And prevention is a lot cheaper than treatment later down the line. So I think that there's a lot of positive steps that the US can and must take to allow that to happen. And like I said, I think the window of opportunity will close very soon.
It seems to me that there should at least be greater thought given to the fact that U.S. policy can move backwards and forwards, that given something now doesn't mean that it can't be taken back if the wrong things happen. I also think the U.S. needs to level set on what it expects for Syria. Well, certainly it may be desirable to have a Syria that is wholly at peace and internally. I think that the priority for U.S. policy is probably Syria's international outcomes. One of the things I thought was very interesting, a strand running through Nick Pelham's conversation, was how much he saw Ahmed al-Sharaa in some ways hearkening back to the Assads. Bashar al-Assad was clumsy and brutal and uncharismatic. Hafez al-Assad, certainly after the 1973 war, seemed to be much shrewder about how he dealt externally and internally. The Hama massacre was horrendous. But the question is, how do you get to a place where you have somebody who might act more like Hafez al-Assad externally, more like early Bashar al-Assad internally, and create something maybe not as positive as you might like, but at least has elements of stability on both the international and domestic front. I don't think the U.S. gets to determine how Syria turns out. I'm not sure Ahmed al-Sharaa gets to determine how Syria turns out. But I think having a clearer sense of the limits of our ambitions and a clearer sense of the potential dynamism of our policy puts us in a better place. Overall, it does seem to me that how this turns out is more consequential than we often like to admit, partly because its impact on Israel, its impact on Iran's regional influence, on Lebanon, on Jordan, on Turkey, on Russia. I mean, there's a way in which all these vectors intersect in Syria. And if anything, it feels to me like we're being a little bit too passive, not because I know exactly what we should do, but because it seems to me that we should be seeking to constructively use influence because so many things run through Syria.
And just to end on a slightly more positive note, hopefully our only options this time aren't Assad 1 or Assad 2 or Saddam Hussein, as Nick mentioned, but something better.
Jon, Natasha, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ninar.
Thanks, Ninar.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.